What if I told you that in the summer of 1943, over 2 million soldiers, 6,000 tanks and 4,000 aircraft clashed in what would become the largest tank battle in history? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're diving deep into the Battle of Kursk, the decisive confrontation that changed the course of World War II forever. By July 1943, Nazi Germany was at a crossroads. After devastating defeats at Stalingrad and in North Africa, Hitler needed a victory to restore German momentum on the Eastern Front. The result was Operation Citadel, Germany's last major offensive against the Soviet Union, and arguably the most important battle you've never heard enough about. So grab your coffee, hit that like button, and let's explore how a bulge in the front lines became the graveyard of German ambitions. To understand Kursk, we need to go back to early 1943. The German army had just suffered catastrophic losses at Stalingrad, losing an entire army group and hundreds of thousands of men. Meanwhile, Soviet forces had begun pushing westward, recapturing territory and gaining confidence. The winter offensive of 1942-43 had seen Soviet forces advance hundreds of miles, liberating cities like Rostov-on-Don, Kursk, and Kharkov. However, German Field Marshal Erich von Manstein's counteroffensive in March 1943 had stabilized the front and recaptured Kharkov, giving the Germans hope they could still turn the tide. But there was one problem for the Soviets: a massive bulge in their front lines around the city of Kursk, about 300 miles south of Moscow. This salient, as military strategists call it, jutted 120 miles into German-held territory and was 200 miles wide. To German commanders, it looked like a perfect target, a vulnerable protrusion they could cut off and destroy, potentially capturing hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Hitler was obsessed with the idea, seeing it as Germany's last chance to regain the strategic initiative. He believed that a successful pincer movement at Kursk would not only eliminate a significant Soviet force but also demonstrate that Germany could still win decisive victories. More importantly, it might convince Stalin to negotiate a separate peace, allowing Germany to focus entirely on the Western Allies. The plan was deceptively simple. German forces would attack from both the north and south of the salient, meeting in the middle and trapping everything inside. Army Group Center would attack from the north near Orel, while Army Group South would strike from the south near Belgorod. They called it Operation Citadel, and Hitler declared it would be a beacon visible to the whole world. The Germans threw everything they had into preparing for Citadel. They concentrated nearly 780,000 men, 2,700 tanks and assault guns, and over 2,000 aircraft for the offensive. This represented about 70% of Germany's entire Eastern Front armored strength, a massive gamble that left other sectors dangerously thin. Hitler delayed the offensive multiple times throughout spring 1943, waiting for new wonder weapons to arrive at the front. The Germans introduced their heaviest tanks yet, the massive Tiger I with its infamous 88mm gun, and the brand new Panther tank, which was supposed to be Germany's answer to the Soviet T-34. They also deployed the Ferdinand tank destroyer, a 70-ton monster with armor up to 200mm thick. These vehicles represented the pinnacle of German engineering, but they came with serious drawbacks. They were mechanically complex, requiring extensive maintenance and highly trained crews. More critically, German industry was struggling to produce them in meaningful numbers. But these delays would prove costly. Every week that passed gave the Soviets more time to prepare, and boy did they use it wisely. The German intelligence network, once the envy of the world, had been severely compromised. What they didn't know was that Soviet intelligence had penetrated the highest levels of German command through their spy network known as the Lucy Ring, based in Switzerland. By May 1943, Stalin knew almost every detail of German plans. He knew the timing, the troop dispositions, even the specific German units involved. Armed with this intelligence, the Soviets began the most extensive defensive preparations in military history. The Soviet response to the impending German offensive was nothing short of extraordinary. Under the direction of Marshal Georgy Zhukov and other top commanders, they turned the Kursk salient into the most heavily fortified position on Earth. The Soviets concentrated over 1.3 million men in the salient, supported by 3,600 tanks, 2,800 aircraft, and over 20,000 artillery pieces. But numbers alone don't tell the story, it was what they did with the time that made the difference. Soviet engineers constructed 8 successive defensive lines, stretching back 120 miles from the front. They dug over 4,000 miles of trenches, enough to stretch from New York to London. They laid over 400,000 anti-tank mines and 450,000 anti-personnel mines. Every village became a fortress, every hill a strong point. The Soviets also prepared mobile reserves. Behind their defensive lines, they positioned entire tank armies ready to counterattack. The plan wasn't just to stop the German offensive, it was to bleed the Germans white in their defensive lines, then launch a devastating counteroffensive that would push the Wehrmacht back hundreds of miles. Perhaps most importantly, Soviet industry was now hitting its stride. Tank production had reached incredible levels, with over 2,000 T-34s rolling off production lines every month. The Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in every category of weapon, and this material advantage was about to pay massive dividends. On July 5, 1943 at 4:30 a.m., Operation Citadel began with the largest artillery bombardment in German history. But the Soviets had anticipated this too. Just minutes before the German barrage began, Soviet artillery opened up on German assembly areas, disrupting the carefully planned offensive before it even started. The northern attack by Army Group Center, led by General Walter Model, immediately ran into trouble. The 9th Army smashed into the Soviet 13th Army's defensive positions and found themselves in a nightmare of minefields, anti-tank ditches, and pre-registered artillery zones. Every German advance was met by waves of T-34 tanks emerging from carefully camouflaged positions. The new German Panthers rushed into service without proper testing, broke down in alarming numbers. Of the 200 Panthers committed to the battle, only 40 were operational by the end of the first day. Transmission failures, final drive problems, and engine fires plagued the sophisticated machines. In the south, Army Group South under Field Marshal Erich von Manstein had better initial success. The famous 2 SS Panzer Corps, including the elite Leibstandard, Das Reich and Totenkopf divisions, managed to penetrate deeper into Soviet lines. But even here, progress was measured in bloody miles rather than the swift breakthrough the Germans had envisioned. The Soviets fought with a desperation born of experience. They had learned hard lessons from the early war disasters, and now they were putting that knowledge to deadly use. Soviet pilots, flying the excellent new Yak-9 and La-5 fighters, challenged German air superiority for the first time since 1941. By July 12, the German southern attack had advanced about 25 miles and was approaching the small town of Prokhorovka. This is where the largest tank battle in history was about to unfold, though the popular image of this clash needs some correction. Soviet General Pavel Rotmistrov launched the 5th Guards Tank Army in a massive counterattack, committing over 800 tanks and self-propelled guns. The Germans met them with about 300 tanks from the 2 SS Panzer Corps. Contrary to popular belief, this wasn't a head-on clash of massed armor, it was a swirling, chaotic melee fought across rolling terrain dotted with small villages and ravines. The battle was incredibly costly for both sides. The Soviets lost over 400 tanks in a single day, with some units suffering 90% casualties. The SS divisions also took heavy losses, with many of their irreplaceable veteran crews killed or wounded. But here's the crucial difference: the Soviets could afford these losses. Their factories were producing more tanks every day, while German tank production was declining under Allied bombing. The fighting at Prokhorovka was characterized by close-range duels where the superior armor of German Tigers and Panthers mattered less. Soviet T-34s, lighter and more maneuverable, could get close enough for their 76mm guns to penetrate German armor. The battlefield became a graveyard of burning metal, with over 700 tanks destroyed or abandoned. More importantly, Prokhorovka marked the high-water mark of German advances. Despite their tactical losses, the Soviets had achieved their strategic objective. They had stopped the German offensive cold. By July 13, it was clear that Operation Citadel had failed. The Germans had advanced at most 30 miles in 8 days of the most intensive fighting imaginable, far short of their objectives. Hitler, facing the Allied invasion of Sicily and growing pressure on other fronts, made the fateful decision to call off the offensive. But the Soviets weren't finished. On July 12, even as the tank battle raged at Prokhorovka, Soviet forces launched Operation Kutuzov against the German positions around Orel in the north. This was followed by Operation Polkovodets-Rumiantsev in the south on August 3. The Soviets had successfully transitioned from defense to offense. The German retreat began almost immediately. Units that had fought desperately to advance a few miles found themselves falling back dozens of miles within days. The carefully constructed German defensive lines, built up over 2 years, crumbled under sustained Soviet pressure. What made the Soviet counteroffensives so devastating was their coordination. Multiple armies attacked simultaneously across a front stretching hundreds of miles. The Germans, already weakened by their failed offensive, couldn't plug all the gaps. For the first time since 1941, German forces were in full retreat across the entire Eastern Front. The psychological impact was as important as the tactical one. German soldiers who had been told they were launching the decisive offensive of the war instead found themselves running for their lives. Meanwhile, Soviet confidence soared as they realized they could not only stop German attacks but drive the Wehrmacht back. The Battle of Kursk was Germany's last realistic chance to regain the initiative on the Eastern Front, and they had blown it spectacularly. German casualties totaled around 200,000 men, including many irreplaceable tank crews and pilots. More importantly, they lost over 760 tanks and 680 aircraft, losses they could never replace. The loss of experienced personnel was particularly devastating. The panzer divisions that had spearheaded Germany's early victories were now shadows of their former selves. The elite Waffen-SS divisions had suffered crippling casualties among their officer corps and veteran non-commissioned officers. Soviet casualties were actually higher in raw numbers, around 320,000 men and over 1,600 tanks lost. But unlike Germany, the Soviet Union could absorb these losses and replace them quickly. By August 1943, Soviet tank strength was already back to pre-battle levels, while German armored units remained severely under strength for months. The strategic implications were enormous. After Kursk, Germany never again launched a major offensive on the Eastern Front. Every subsequent German action was reactive, responding to Soviet initiatives rather than setting the agenda. The Wehrmacht, once the most feared military force in the world, had been reduced to fighting for survival. Kursk also marked the beginning of an unbroken string of Soviet victories that would carry them all the way to Berlin. Within 3 months, Soviet forces had liberated Ukraine's capital at Kiev. By the end of 1943, they had pushed German forces back hundreds of miles and crossed the Dnieper River. Perhaps most significantly, Kursk demonstrated that the Soviet military had evolved from the disorganized force that suffered catastrophic defeats in 1941. Soviet generals now displayed tactical sophistication that matched their German counterparts, while Soviet industry provided them with quantitative superiority. The Battle of Kursk represents one of history's great turning points, the moment when Nazi Germany's fate was sealed. Hitler's gamble to restore German fortunes through one decisive victory had failed catastrophically, and the consequences would echo across the remaining 2 years of World War II. What makes Kursk so fascinating from a military perspective is how it marked a true turning point in the evolution of warfare. Never before had the world seen such a massive, carefully coordinated clash of arms. It was the perfection of combined arms doctrine, tanks, infantry, artillery, and aircraft, all converging in a storm of steel and fire across the rolling wheat fields of southern Russia. Kursk was not simply a duel of machines, but a brutal contest of minds, of planning, of endurance. On one side, the German war machine with its formidable new panzers; on the other, the Soviet Union with layer upon layer of defense, waiting for the blow they knew would come. But the true lesson of Kursk lies in how victory was forged. It was not just about who had the bravest soldiers or the most advanced weapons. This was a battle decided as much by intelligence networks, railway schedules, and factories as by the courage of men in foxholes. The Soviets had cracked German plans, and with every day Hitler delayed his offensive, their defenses grew deeper, stronger, deadlier. His obsession with wonder weapons meant he threw in untested machines like the Panther, which broke down en masse, turning dreams of superiority into a logistical nightmare. Technology, Kursk proved, is nothing without reliability, preparation, and timing. And the cost was almost beyond comprehension. In just over a month, more than 500,000 men were killed, wounded, or went missing. Behind every statistic was a shattered family, a life cut short, a future erased. The Eastern Front had become a furnace where entire generations were consumed. Kursk wasn't just a battle, it was a human catastrophe on an industrial scale. Yet from that furnace, a new reality emerged. The myth of German invincibility was broken. The Red Army had not only stopped the Wehrmacht, they had struck back, proving they could outfight, outproduce, and outlast their enemy. From Kursk onward, the initiative shifted. For Germany, the war became a fight for survival. For the Soviets, it became a march of vengeance, pushing westward toward Berlin. The Battle of Kursk is more than a chapter in World War II, it is a timeless lesson. Wars are not won by the side with the fanciest tanks or the boldest plans, but by the side that masters timing, intelligence, and endurance. The Germans had sleek designs and daring strategies, but the Soviets had foresight, overwhelming numbers, and a clear strategic vision. That made all the difference. So I'll leave you with a question. What strikes you most about Kursk? The scale of the battle? The human tragedy? Or the way a single decision, delaying an attack, shifted the entire war? Let me know in the comments. And don't forget to subscribe for more deep dives into history's turning points. Next time we'll look at how the aftermath of Kursk set the stage for the Soviet liberation of Ukraine, and the long bloody road to Berlin. Until then, remember, history isn't just about battles and dates. It's about choices that change the course of civilization.